you can go to their own writings and their own sermons and see what they're actually saying about apostles and prophets and see if that lines up with what they say when they're challenged.
So back in the late 1980s, so it's 1988, my wife and I got swept up into the latter rain movement, and we were told at that time that God had just recently restored prophets to the church. That was part of the latter rain restoration. In fact, C. Peter Wagner writes about that in his book Apostles Today, and so the church that we were in, we had a prophetess over us. And what's fascinating is that I try to explain to people that even if somebody today claims to be a continuationist, that the people who preceded them, they were all restorationists. So we were told when I was in the latter rain that God had restored apostles and prophets. If you read Frank Bartleman, his eyewitness account of the Azusa Street revival, Frank Bartleman talks about the restoration of the gifts, not the continuation of them. And so when I was growing up, nobody can claim at that point that, oh yeah, we've always had prophets in the church, because there weren't any when I was a kid. There weren't any when I was in high school. They only started showing up in my early 20s, and there were no apostles. There was nobody claiming to be an apostle until really the early 2000s. And so when today's continuationists talk about the function of apostle, oftentimes I hear them making a reference to the function, somehow talking about missionaries being apostles, people who are church planters or people who are pioneers of a movement. They consider that they're serving in an apostolic function, which basically makes me ask this question, because I remember where the bodies are buried, because I've been around a while. In Charisma magazine back in the day, C. Peter Wagner wrote this article called "Where Are the Apostles and Prophets?" And the way he's defining apostles and prophets here, he's clearly not talking about missionaries. And he's not talking about those who are operating in the function of an apostle. So are the people in the NAR basically obfuscating and dealing with like two completely different definitions in order to kind of blur lines to kind of hide what the real history is here? What is your explanation for things like this?
Yeah, it does seem that way. It's very common for leaders in this movement when they're challenged, on this notion of what they're promoting, these apostles and prophets, for them to say, oh, we're not talking about apostles in any sense different than missionaries and church planners, like you said. And in fact, in the recent NAR and Christian nationalism statement that was drafted by Joseph Matera and Michael Brown, that they published and that many other leaders came on and have signed, when they define apostles, they say we're talking about basically like missionaries and church planners, and you can even not be a charismatic and be an apostle in our definition. But then what we do, we wrote a lengthy response that is published on my website to this document, and what we show is that many of the signatories of this document and the initial signatories, and even Joseph Matera himself, have promoted apostles and prophets in a very different way than just missionaries and church planners in their writings, in their teachings, and their messages. You can see that these are authoritative apostles and prophets, and that they're bringing new revelation. We're not talking about just missionaries and church planners. And so it is like they're giving one definition. They're presenting apostles and prophets in their writings and their messages and their sermons as authoritative, as bringing new revelation. But then when they're questioned or challenged on it, they go, oh, no, we're just talking about missionaries and church planners. And so that does definitely seem to be going on.
Yeah, and let me show you one more thing, Holly. This is the cover of C. Peter Wagner's book, Apostles Today. The subtitle is "Biblical Government for Biblical Power." He's not talking about missionaries in this book, is he?
No, he's not. And he's not. And the thing is, the other NAR leaders are not talking about that either. And we document that in our book and in all of our books and our writings. We show that from their own words. You can go to their own writings and their own sermons and see what they're actually saying about apostles and prophets and see if that lines up with what they say when they're challenged. And I think people will see for themselves that they're clearly not just talking about missionaries and church planners.
Well, and
right,
they do, it is in their writings. It is in their explicit teachings. It's what they say when they're at conferences, whether they're traveling around this country or down in Brazil or someplace like that. And what they might say is, but they are missionaries. They are, Christian statesmen and so forth. Well, okay, if you want to use that language, now let's talk about what you believe they're capable of doing. Mm-hmm. And so this may be another case where they're prepared to invest safe-sounding language with dangerous new theological significance. And that's a very typical practice that we talk about in the book Counterfeit Kingdom. Euphemisms that they use, language that even the way they conceive of prayer, the gospel, the nature of the kingdom, this is all familiar language. Why not do the same thing with the concept of missionary, or church leader, and just mean something different by it than what most people would associate with those terms in order to sneak under the radar.
Yeah. When I see somebody like Apostle Guillermo Maldonado, I don't think he's using the term apostle to mean that he's a missionary.
Yeah. No. The other thing we see this with is the term fivefold ministry. Mm-hmm. The whole concept of fivefold ministry, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, that the church government is to be made up of this fivefold ministry, being these offices. It was popularized by the Latter Rain movement, as you discuss. And but now what you see NAR leaders doing is they're moving away from the office language, some of them, because it's been pointed out that they're promoting these governing offices. And so now they're not using the term office, like Doug mentioned. They're saying, no, we're just talking about functions, or sometimes they'll refer to them as the ascension gifts, or, we're just talking about the fivefold ministry. But really, typically, what is being used when they're talking about fivefold ministry, they're talking about the governing or the authoritative apostles and prophets. So people need to be very careful. If there are other Pentecostals and charismatics who don't believe apostles and prophets are authoritative or that they hold offices, they need to be very careful when they use the term fivefold ministry. And really, we would say they probably shouldn't be using that term, because typically what people mean when they use the term fivefold ministry is they're referring to these authoritative governing roles in the church.
Yeah.
Well, notice how they're playing tricks with language here. And we've now noticed two ways this is done. One is to take language that's familiar, with which we make certain associations that are biblical and they're fine, and they invest them with new significance, sometimes without drawing attention to what's novel and what's unique, what's different about it, so that they can fool people about what an apostle is supposed to be or what a missionary is or what have you. The other thing they do is they interject new terminology, new language into the discussion, and it means something in particular. I'll give you the example in a moment that I'm most concerned about here. They'll inject new language into the discussion, and then they'll try to normalize it and mainstream it so that they'll get other people to buy into the language and thereby buy into the theology. And we believe that that's what's going on with this talk about fivefold ministry. They get the language of fivefold ministry from counting how many ministries and functions are listed in Ephesians 4:11. There are 5. And then they've made this their manifesto, and they call it the fivefold ministry. And it's this defining feature of their church practice and their ministries. Now they're trying to mainstream this by getting other charismatics and Pentecostals to adopt the same language. And I'm a little concerned that this is actually happening to some degree, where without knowing the history of the genesis of this terminology in the latter rain and maybe some earlier antecedents or precedents for that, they are sort of unwittingly capitulating to this new description by adopting language that is really should be reserved for our understanding of NAR teachers. And so when people who are listening to us today hear references to the fivefold ministry, we think that it would be wise to be concerned that perhaps this is an allusion to overt NAR teaching, and that if you slip into using that language, you're actually a party to that same deception.